Welcome to Pub Natter, where we record each episode in a different pub in Rutland, the smallest county in England. In each episode, your hosts, Tim and Justin, give a voice to the landlords and landladies and a special guest with a specific area of interest or expertise. We hope you enjoy our chats, and it encourages you to go and explore our little county and all it has to offer. Like the motto says, there is much in little. In this episode, we continue our chat with Lammie, our host, and Tim Sexton, the Senior Species Recording Officer at the Leicestershire and Rutland Wildlife Trust at the Vaults in Uppingham, Rutland. Our discussion begins with the Rutland Water Osprey Breeding Project. When rain stops play, it's time for some pub natter.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the Osprey project.
Yeah. Well, we're only talking about today that the ospreys are due back, any day now. So within the next couple of weeks, we'll probably start to see the first ospreys returning to Rutland Water. So, for us, it's the first sign of spring, and it's a massively important part of what we do at Rutland Water. So back in the late 90s, there was a project that was set up to try and bring ospreys back to England. They've been established in Scotland for probably about 100 years prior to that, but obviously they went extinct in England about 150 years ago as a result of persecution. And it was a project that was set up by Leicestershire and Rutland Wildlife Trust to actually reintroduce them back into England at Rutland Water. The first pair came back to breed in 2001, and 2023 we celebrated a massive milestone in the project, the 250th osprey chick, to be raised through that project. Obviously our long-standing pair, Maya and 3311, that are probably famous the world round, really, to be honest, through our webcam at Manton Bay, which is the main nest that's actually at Rutland Water.
So for our listeners, people can watch
that's right. Yeah,
live on a webcam.
Yeah, so you can go onto the Leicestershire and Rutland Wildlife Trust website, and you can actually watch the webcam. We've got a YouTube channel, our Facebook, or our social media, Instagram, and things like that. During the osprey season, there's daily updates on what the activity is of the ospreys, we've got 2 cameras trained on that main nest in Manton Bay, but there's about 13 other nests in the local area. Local landowners support osprey platforms with nests on their land. They go all the way down to Northampton, and pretty much Rugby, really, to be honest, in terms of where else we've got nests that we monitor.
When you say they come back,
where do they go?
Where have they been?
Yeah, so they go down to Africa, so they go down to the Gambia mostly, and they overwinter in the Gambia and then come back to the UK to breed. Some go further up, go all the way up to Scandinavia. It's all about food availability and competition.
This isn't a tourist podcast.
Yeah. Birds really only travel for 2 things, and that's food and sex, really, to be honest. So it's you've got more hours of daylight during the summer in the UK, and obviously if the birds that go further up into Scandinavia, even more hours of daylight, so they can rear their chicks much quicker. There's far less competition for food, because obviously there's all the African species, the native species that they have to compete with to get food there. The climate, of course, the temperatures more suited to them for breeding. So it's worth the risk,
How do they navigate their way back to exactly the same spot?
Nobody really knows. So there's this, the wonder of migration is we still don't really know. We suspect there's some sort of magnetic compass that birds use, and they're able to navigate broadly to get south and to get back up north again. But certainly when we first introduced the chicks to Rutland Water in the early days of the project, we took some chicks from nests in Scotland, and we brought them to Rutland Water about 2 weeks before or 3 weeks before they were ready to fledge, reared them on fish in these purpose-built cages, and then released them when they were old enough to do so. And it's in those first sort of few weeks of their life that they actually build up a picture of where home is. So they don't think they're from Scotland. They start to investigate the local area, fly around sort of ever larger circles, working out where home is. And then they'll follow things like rivers, natural navigational routes, mountain ranges, hills, things like that.
But at night time,
It's predominantly at night time. Yeah, it's incredible. How they managed to do it, we will never know. There was a bird that we satellite tracked, and that typically they will fly down the west coast of England, go down sort of the west coast of France, Spain, Portugal, then the west coast of Africa. For some reason, this satellite tracked bird went right out to sea into the Atlantic. Must have found this little archipelago, small range of islands or something where there's some really good feeding, spent a few days feeding there, and then went down towards North Africa, where then it carried on its migration. And what was interesting, in the 3 years after following that bird with this satellite tracker on it, we could actually see it did the exact same route on its return migration as well.
do they go to the same spot in Africa as well?
Pretty much, yeah. So we have teams of volunteers that go out to the Gambia to actually monitor ospreys down there as well. And you can pretty much
Do you need any more volunteers?
Yeah, unfortunately, they pay their own airfare and things like that, so it's not the sort of volunteering I think you were looking for. But they can almost pinpoint them to within, a few square kilometres of where that bird is going to be overwintering. So they have sort of overwintering territories as well as breeding territories. But it's incredible. There was a satellite tagged bird. It wasn't one of ours, that was being tracked from, I think, one of the nests in Dorset. And this jumped on we assume it jumped on a container ship. And it went most of the way to sort of North Africa on this container ship without having to even flap a wing beat. And then it sort of realised what had happened, flew back to almost where it started, and then back in the north, southern England, and then flew back down south again. So we've got no idea what was going on there. But it just, again, it's just one of these mysteries that I don't think we'll ever get to the bottom of.
So when you said that you had the first pair in 2001, have all of the population come from that one pair, or do you? No.
So there was quite a few birds. I think it was 64, I think, in the first reintroduction, and then there was found to be, I think it was more females than males. So some more males were brought down from Scotland, following on from that. So it's about 100 birds in total. And then obviously we've had birds from other populations like Wales come into. So we've had some Welsh tagged birds that have bred at Rutland. Obviously, there's this now breeding population down in Dorset, and there's a hope that the next step of the project for us will be supplying chicks to a reintroduction project in Suffolk. So then we've got pretty much all four corners of the UK covered, and the central part is Rutland Water.
And is the population size self-regulating? Do they need a certain amount of territory per
so again,
bird or family or whatever?
Yeah, you need to have a lot of surface feeding fish, so they feed predominantly on trout, which obviously for Rutland Water is great. There's about 80,000 trout added to the water there every year. And so they feed predominantly on surface feeding fish. They do feed at Ibrook and other places locally. The Hornmill Trout Farm has made quite a business for themselves. Obviously, it started off very bad for them in the early days of the project. Because they're like, well, these fish-eating birds are going to come and eat all our fish, and they were. And Tim McCrill, who's pretty much led the Osprey project over the last.
Did you say
20,
Tim Mackerel?
Tim McCrill, not Mackerel. But he's led the project over the last sort of 20, 30 years, and he's. He met with the owners of the trout farm and got them to set up these photography hides that they charge quite a significant amount of money for bird watchers and photographers to go and take these sort of shots at the water level. They're sunken into the ground, these hides. You can literally see the birds coming in and take fish out of the water. And it sort of subsidised the losses that they've encountered for their business through the Osprey taking them. We did have last year a couple of rather prize-looking koi brought back to the Mountain Bay nest that came from a rather disgruntled local resident, which opened up a completely different conversation. But yeah, it's fascinating to watch their behaviour, from the moment they first arrived back on the nest, sort of towards the end of March, all through to September when the chicks fledge. We can see all the intimate details. Not all good, some of it's bad. We've had large fish brought back to the nest that weren't quite fully dead, and they had a bit of a muscle spasm last year, and it sort of took out a couple of the chicks, so we're only left with one of the chicks last year.
Wow.
So it is like the EastEnders of the conservation world, really. To be honest, there's constantly drama, something to keep you on your toes.
That's a terrible way to go.
Slap around the back of the head with a trout.
Billy Bass. Billy Bass death.
I don't know what
Coroner's report.
I don't know what it says about me, but as soon as you said Osprey, I immediately thought the grain store.
Yes, that is my grain store tipple when this isn't available.
Well, so what can we learn from ospreys?
Well, they're fantastic birds.
Yeah,
very
well,
resilient.
yeah.
That obviously, I always say with conservation, people often get very disheartened by the state of nature in Britain. We're one of the most nature-depleted countries, but projects like the Osprey project show that we actually can, reverse these massive changes. I'll give you an example. I led a group just recently, last summer, which was a climate youth council, and we're talking about conservation and managing nature reserves like Rutland Water, Attenborough Nature Reserve. It was down at Nottingham University. And one of the questions I got asked at the end is, with all the sort of devastation we're seeing in the natural world, what gives you hope? And my answer to that was, Rutland Water gives me hope. 50 years ago, this was really poor quality farmland, essentially a desert for wildlife. There was barely anything there that you could see. And within 50 years, we've got 650 species of beetle. We're internationally important for our overwintering waterfowl with 25,000 birds during the winter months. We've got the Osprey project, a little-known reintroduction project, but we reintroduced water voles into Rutland Water as well back in the early 2011.
I never realised they were dying out.
Yeah, in the sort of late 90s, there were barely... So they'd gone from, sites with 200, say, water voles on them to barely anything by the late 90s. There was
When as a kid, I used to go fishing, and you couldn't move for water voles.
No.
They were everywhere.
I mean, I hear stories from other birders where they'll sit on a bench, eat their lunch, break a bit of apple off, drop it on the floor, and a water vole would come and eat it,
So what happened?
North American mink happened is one of the main reasons for the decline in water voles. There were early introductions of mink were returning soldiers from World War II were given a male and female mink to start up their own businesses doing fur farming. And of course, people got back from the war and they were like, thanks, I was expecting a medal, but I've got two mink. Yeah, what am I going to do with those?
Whose idea was that?
No idea where the origins for that came from. But basically, they were released, they escaped, they weren't housed properly. So that was the sort of earliest reintroduction.
Bearing in mind that during the First World War, the people in charge thought it was a good idea to walk slowly towards the guns. So handing people mink at the end of all that is probably felt completely normal to them.
But I'm just thinking, there must have been a few people sat around the table and thought, what can we give these guys when they come home?
Heroes, let's give them a mink.
A couple of mink.
Got an idea.
It's where did that come from?
Yeah, who knows? And then during the 60s, the sort of animal rights movement really took off, and it was animal rights campaigners that went into fur farms and released mink en masse across the British landscape that really caused the problems. It was the sort of final nail in the coffin for water voles in Britain.
Wow. So presumably, as the voles died down, so did the mink.
No, because the mink, they're
anything.
voracious predators. They'll feed on anything, small birds, rabbits, fish, anything they can get hold of. But obviously, water voles were their main source of prey.
Right.
Before we started this water vole reintroduction project, we worked with local landowners to eradicate mink around Rutland Water and the immediate sort of landscape of Rutland Water, and we're very successful in doing so. And because there's no major watercourses feeding into the reservoir, it's meant that in the last, 11, 12 years, we've not seen a single mink at Rutland. We've got a very healthy otter population as well, which is probably helping to keep the mink numbers down. So where you've got large otter populations and low mink populations, the otters tend to sort of be very territorial and keep the mink out.
So the mink commonly found in the UK?
They are now, yeah. There's big projects by an organisation called Water Life Recovery, and they've pretty much eradicated mink across Suffolk and Norfolk, and are starting to move up into Lincolnshire and into areas of Rutland and Leicestershire as well. It's been hugely successful. So, despite many people thinking it would be nigh on impossible to remove and eradicate North American mink from Britain, they're making good ground. But yeah, pretty much across the length and breadth, they're quite a common species around wetlands and rivers, and cause devastation. You know,
No idea.
Again, non-native invasive species.
But when does a non-native species become a native species? Because eventually, because everything comes here, eventually, doesn't it?
Well, they do. So some things make their own way here. So we've seen anglers complain about cormorants. They call the cormorant the Chinese cormorant, because we've got our coastal species of cormorant, which is Carbro, and this is Carbro sinensis, which means Chinese in Latin. And this is a species that it's a subspecies, not an actual species. It's a subspecies of our coastal breeding cormorant that's native to Britain, that breeds in sort of Central Europe and large lakes on the continent. And it's made its own way here as a result of changing climate, decided one day, want to go to England and we'll go see what's happening there. And they've become established.
Whereas, do you call that a native species?
You call that an established species. So they're species that have made their own way, and yes, it would be a native species.
So how far back do you have to go to become a native species?
Well, it's like you could look at rabbits, which were introduced by the Romans, and say, is that a native species? And I think most people would consider rabbit to be a native species to Britain, whereas something like the harlequin ladybird, anyone that's opened their bathroom window and looked around the window frame at all those millions of ladybirds that you get there, this is a species that was introduced from Asia to control aphid populations in farm settings and orchards, and it was found to be better suited to the British climate than the Asian climate, and the population just exploded, and they're almost wiping out our native species of ladybird now. So they're problematic species that, are probably still going to be here in 100 years' time, but I think they'll still be considered as invasive, non-native species.
So do you go back to the last ice age and everything established?
It's the last ice age and everything that established beyond that. Yeah.
I mean, I didn't know until 4 or 5 years ago that horses are not native to the Americas. They were introduced by the Spanish. I had no idea.
I know. And we kindly introduced rats to Australia and New Zealand, didn't we?
Yeah. And cattle as well. So, interesting story about cattle and the connection between court cats is that the British introduced cattle to Australia, but there were no dung beetles to basically eat the dung. So flies flourished, and they had massive plagues of flies in Australia. In Australia, and that's where the idea for these court cats came from, that are synonymous with Australians, court cats. Yeah. And it wasn't until about, I think it was 150 years later, that somebody actually made the connection between the non-existence of dung beetles in Australia and the problem that they have with flies. So they introduced dung beetles, and they found that the fly problem disappeared for the large part. I mean, you watch Aussie Gold Hunters and they're forever doing that, aren't they? So, but yeah, it's an interesting connection with beetles and Australia.
In front of me, I've got a pot of tiny shells. Well, not tiny, but it looks like a miniature sea mussel that you would expect to find on the beach in Norfolk. Thousands of them.
Yep.
And so what have we got here?
So these are shells of quagga mussels. So we're talking a little bit about invasive non-native species, and this is probably one of our biggest headaches at Rutland Water. So I mentioned that obviously we have an internationally important designation of Ramsar, SPA and SSSI, Special Site of Scientific Interest, or Site of Special Scientific Interest. And that is for the assemblage of winter waterfowl that we get at Rutland every winter, up to 25,000 winter ducks at any one time during the coldest months of the year. And this is a species, the quagga mussel, that appeared in 2020, so relatively recently, but has managed to completely change the ecology of the lake at Rutland Water. So they're extremely effective filter feeders. So we've had a species of mussel that's also invasive and non-native and comes from the same region, actually, of the Black Sea, which is where the quagga mussel comes from. And that was called the zebra mussel.
So how did they get here, just to start off
So
with?
zebra mussels, quagga mussels, and many of the other species that are associated with them. There's a whole range of different gammarids, the shrimp, that are associated and have a sort of relationship with the mussels. They've all come in ballast water from ships. So ships come in from the Black Sea, fill up the ballast water from the Black Sea, come over to the UK, drop their cargo off in the Thames or wherever it is they're dropping the cargo off, release the ballast water, and within that ballast water is all these novel species that would have never made their way to Britain were it not for humans moving them around. And they eventually snake their way up through the UK along the major rivers, and of course they pump in from the Nene back into Rutland water, and that's where the quagga mussels, we assume, have come from. The zebra mussels have been in the UK since about the mid-1800s, so you could argue that they've sort of become part of our native fauna, although be it invasive and non-native in their own right. But the quagga mussels, despite being very similar to the zebra mussels, are far more voracious feeders than zebra mussels, and they actually outcompete the zebra mussels. And over the last sort of 50 years, species like tufted duck, for instance, which feed almost predominantly on freshwater mussels during the winter months when they're in the UK. Pochard is another species, goldeneye. We've seen numbers of those decline massively since quagga mussels have appeared, and we're currently doing a huge piece of work with Anglian Water trying to fully understand the impact of quagga mussels in the reservoir. So quagga mussels, or zebra mussels, within a square metre of the sort of bottom of the lake, you could probably get about 800 zebra mussels in that area. With quagga mussels, you can get anything up to about 20,000 quagga mussels per square metre. So they're far more voracious feeders. They form huge, great big colonies. And there's some good evidence to suggest they're thermophobic, so they don't actually like warmer water. And obviously, Rutland water being a very deep reservoir, 35 metres deep at its greatest depth. The quagga mussels go to levels that the ducks can't actually physically dive to. So although there's lots of mussels there, they're actually out of the range of the diving ducks, which is typically around 8 metres.
But the zebra mussels can't coexist at the shallower depths?
No, so what happens is that the quagga mussels actually take all the food away from the zebra mussels, and the zebra mussels eventually die out because they can't retreat into the deeper waters where the quagga mussels are when we get the big changes in water levels at the reservoir.
So when you say voracious feeder...
Yeah. So they're filter feeders.
Yeah, but surely you can only filter so much at the same speed as the next mussel.
They can do about 1,000 litres per day of water per mussel. So 20,000 mussels, that's 20,000 litres of water being filtered.
1,000 litres a day goes through?
Goes through that. So it's
just about the size of a fingernail.
Yes, size of a thumbnail. That can filter 1,000 cubic metre of water.
Every day.
Every day.
And what they do, so the what we call the pelagic zone, which is the area where the food is, so that's like zooplankton, all the little creepy crawlies in the water, phytoplankton, all the different algae and smaller plants. They typically in like in a reservoir would go from the sort of top level of the water down to the bottom. And what happens where you get quagga mussels is that pelagic zone contracts, gets much smaller. So you've got a much smaller layer of food within the water, but it also moves lower in the water body. So not only can the ducks not access the mussels that they would have been feeding on since pretty much the reservoir was first filled with water, but the other ducks that feed on the zooplankton, so things like shoveler duck, for instance, can't access any food either because it's essentially cleared the water column. And where we do some sampling for these at Rutland Water, the water level's probably about, say, 7 or 8 metres, something like that deep. And you can actually now see the bottom from the surface because the water is crystal clear because essentially all of the water column has been filtered out. And we're seeing an increase of macrophyte growth, so the pond weeds, we're seeing bigger growth of pond weeds as a result of more light being able to penetrate through the water body, and those pond weeds are thriving. So we are actually seeing increases in species like teal, for instance. In fact, last month or the month before last, we had our highest count of teal in 25 years.
Sorry,
And we
what's
think
teal?
Teal it's actually our smallest European duck, but they feed predominantly on pondweeds. So
Right.
they're doing really well out of the quagga mussels. Whereas a lot of species, coot for instance, historically we would have seen in the winter months about 7,000 or 8,000 coot at any one time during December, January, February. We're now seeing probably 700 or 800. It's a huge drop
They've all
in
moved to
number.
Oakham Canal. They have.
But some have gone to Ibrook and other places,
Right,
we
yeah.
think, but they've probably spread. The issue is, I suppose, with the quagga mussels, is there's lots of other factors that are confounding the issue. So we've got warmer winter climate, so we're seeing this phenomenon of short stopping, so fewer birds are coming from the continent to the UK to overwinter because it's milder on the continent. We're seeing short staying for the same reason. Birds are going back to their breeding grounds earlier than they would have done historically because of the milder temperatures. And then a whole other host of things like hunting and human factors that are affecting bird populations in general. So it's really hard to sort of pinpoint one particular issue. You can't say that, well, it's the quagga mussels that has caused the decline in ducks, because there's all these other factors that are causing issues for you as well.
So is this a natural process that, on a evolutionary timescale, may well happen, but it's been accelerated by human activity?
Yeah, I mean, you look at like the last 100 years, for instance. We've seen declines of species, extinctions of species like we've never seen in history. In 10,000 years. So it really has accelerated, and we've got all these other issues like globalization, agriculture intensification. We're building our towns and cities at rates that we've never seen before.
I think they've
into natural areas. And
haven't they given it an Anthropomorphine? We've now we're now into a different
we are
era.
in that era that basically the effects
age
of
of
humans.
Yeah.
It's
mad, isn't it?
we dig
Extinction
up we
event.
dig up fossils from the Jurassic era today. What will we be digging up in thousands of years' time? Is it going to be a layer of plastic? And it does make you wonder, doesn't it? What will the archaeologists of tomorrow be digging up?
Us, probably.
Yeah. Lots of plastic surrounding us, I would imagine.
Crikey. So is there a positive aspect to this? I mean, like some fungi are invasive and quite nasty, but they've discovered that they can break down coal and oil
plastics,
and
even.
plastics.
Yeah.
So we've kind of discovered that there's a real positive side. Could there be a positive side to
I think
these
unless
things?
somebody can come up with a really nice sort of moules marinière for quagga mussels, I can't see a positive myself.
But you said they cleared the water. They
but clear water's not always a good thing, So
It's good for teal.
it's good for teal,
Yeah.
but the large number of species has declined as a result of quagga mussels. Well, we assume of quagga mussels.
But if you want to make some polluted water into drinking water, stick a load of quagga mussels in it.
Well, so the interesting thing is they eat pretty much all different types of algae except for microcystis, which is typically termed the dog killer.
Yeah.
This is the nasty
The one they don't
blue-green
like.
algae, the one that they don't like. So not even quagga mussels eat microcystis. So what we've seen at
God.
Rutland is actually increased incidence of algal blooms as a result of quagga mussels being there. So it's hard to find a positive at all, really.
So what's
to
the
be
plan
honest.
then?
If you could wave a magic wand and get rid of quagga mussels out of Rutland water tomorrow, I guarantee that as soon as you start pumping water back into the reservoir from the river, the veligas, which are the larvae of the quagga mussels, are minuscule. They will come back into the water and become established within another 2 or 3 years. So it really, we can't see any way forward. Anything that you could add to the water, like copper has been suggested in the past, would have a detrimental effect on the native biodiversity of the reservoir. It's really, really difficult.
What about
Are there any
effects?
kind of membranes that you could put in so that you could contain them to a particular area or something like that?
Yeah, to be honest, there's been a lot of studies in the Great Lakes in America where there've been a big problem, and again, similar depth of lakes to Rutland, and they've tried screens, they've tried filters. I mean, one thing that's been suggested is have a screen on the pumps that pumping from the Nene, but you're pumping something like 8,000 litres per second. I can't see any man-made
stopping
material or whatever that could stop. You know, you'll just rip through the screens at that kind of that velocity. So, yeah, it's a very difficult situation, really. There's a couple of species of shrimp that are associated with those. Dichrogammarus velocis and Hemobaphys, the killer and the demon shrimp. And they're also causing problems for our native species of gammarids. So it's just at all levels they're bad news, really, to be honest. Like many invasive species, you know, birds and stuff can spend 3 or 4 weeks trying to get from one side of the planet to the other. We can fly potentially invasive species within 24 hours now from any corner of the globe to anywhere else. You know, it's very difficult.
But when you get species where there are literally a handful of animals left, so there are some I think rhinos or something like that. There are some species that there are one pair left in the world.
Cheetahs are a good example where they've got genetic depressions because there's so few cheetahs.
But when you're trying to sort of salvage a species, you've managed to find one pair left. Can you bring them back, or is it too late?
I think it's almost a lost cause at that point. You can, you know, obviously maintain the population for X number of years, but it would just take one particular disease that could wipe them out because there's no opportunity for any individual within that population to have a particular gene that means that they're not affected by that disease or illness or whatever.
Is there like a critical mass you would need within?
I'm sure there is. I don't know exactly what it is in a population. Population genetics was probably the bit at university that I was asleep for, to be honest, or hungover. But yeah, I would imagine there is. There's this freshwater invertebrate that's very, very small, and you can only see it through a microscope at about 400 times magnification. So it's a tiny, tiny thing, and it's called a rotifer. And they're famous for not having had sex in about 2 million years, right? So they get around this idea of genetic...
Sorry,
I feel like you need a pause there.
That's a lot of marriage.
Yeah, you heard right. So they've reproduced asexually, so they've just produced exact clones of themselves for something like 2 million years.
Is that a hermaphrodite?
Yeah. And the way they've got around inbreeding depressions is they steal genetic material from other creatures in the water. So they're actually able to sort of assimilate genetic material from algae, from other freshwater invertebrates.
This is turning into an episode of Star Trek.
It's like, I tell you
really?
What, get a drop of water under a microscope and have a look at it at 400 times.
They steal DNA.
Yeah, so they actually steal DNA.
So we think that we've invented gene editing, and yet there's a natural...
It's been rotifers.
Been doing it for millennia.
Absolutely amazing, yeah.
Crikey.
I don't like the idea of not having sex for a couple of million years, to be honest, but the rest of rotifers sounds really cool.
I don't like the idea of being alive for over a million years.
Well, I'm sure one individual hasn't been alive for a million years, but rotifers as a group have.
But, yeah, I mean, that is incredible. Because they've almost reached evolutionary perfection in the sense that they are able to keep reproducing themselves.
Yeah.
But
just
they
produce exact clones of themselves.
And they instinctively know enough to know that they need to somehow alter themselves to continue.
He looks all right. Let's steal a bit of his arm and see how that helps us out. Oh, yeah, that's great. That'll keep us going for another 1,000 years or so.
But we didn't even know we had genes until 75 years ago.
I know. Unbelievable. And then Levi's comes along and everyone's wearing them.
Oh, that's funny. You should be in our quiz team. Just realised.
Well, yeah.
We got a quiz team and we never win.
Right. Is it the natural history that lets you
They've
down?
never asked us about rotifers, though, have they?
I sit on many quiz teams, but I've never found where my special talent can come in handy. Rubbish
we don't have an
rubbish
insect
at pop
round.
music. And, if we had an insect round, put me on the team.
That'd be probably the moment you go to the loo.
Yeah, that's it. Question. Oh, God,
Even the thing is, when there's 400,000 different species of beetle, he won't know all of them. I bet the quizmaster will have it.
Do you know, when we started doing this, I thought we'd get some interesting people coming along, but blimey.
Yeah,
Mind of information. What do you do in your spare time?
Look down a microscope.
Really?
Yeah. So
Do you have another life? Have you got a family?
I have family, so I've got a wife and 2 children. So
Do you know what they're called?
I think Jake is my oldest and Sophie's my youngest, so they're 13 and 8. I'm not very good at remembering human names because, you can ask a human what their name is and they'll tell you. It's very difficult to do that with a beetle, so I've sort of reserved all of my spare brain capacity for remembering scientific names of invertebrates and just forget people's human names.
So it's only
often.
Latin names you know.
It's
now,
only
isn't it?
Latin
That's
names,
Latin
really, to be honest. Yeah.
Or
But
Beyonce.
the
When you're
kids go
differentiating
out and
600 types of beetle,
yeah.
I mean, how different are they? I mean, clearly some are clear.
Some are very, very similar, and you actually have to look at genitalia to be able to separate one species from another. So I've got a bit of a bad name for myself from sending friends pictures of beetle genitalia, and I wouldn't like to say I make a habit of
Appear
it.
on
but-
Jeremy Kyle.
No, it's only a matter of time. I'm sure.
Sounds like a bollocks to me.
Yeah. But
I would have to bar you if you started doing that in here.
But yeah, I mean, I could show you a few now if you like. But it really comes down to there are so few differences that you have to just dissect the animal and have a look at its genitalia, and it's always unique to that particular species. Whereas other species you can look at in the field and you can go, yeah, that's such and such, yeah, that's such and such. The features are more obvious. But yeah, that's why it takes time. You've got to find the reference material to be able to identify it. So we use dichotomous keys. So these are like these murder mystery books you used to have as a kid, where you read through the book and you make the story up yourself. So it says if you want to go down the dark, scary alley, go to page 45, or if you want to go across the lush green meadow, go to page 75. And it's a bit like that. So you go down a series of 2 questions in couplets, each of which sort of asks you something about the species you're looking at. So what shape are the antenna? How many segments does the antenna have? Whatever. Go to the next step, hairs on the legs or whatever, something else it'll ask you about. And then eventually you've sort of whittled it down to the species. The last option is the species that you're looking at in front of you. But of course, you've got to find that material. It's either very expensive books or you can find keys available online to download. But when you're looking at many thousands of species, it can be hard enough just to get it into the family level, let alone the species level.
So have you ever found anything that hasn't previously been documented?
So I had, when I worked for Attenborough Nature Reserve, I found a species of flatworm in the nature garden behind the visitors centre there. And I had a key to the planarians or flatworms in Britain, went through the key, couldn't make it fit any of the species on the key. Started looking up for some more online resources because a lot of flatworms tend to get imported with garden plants in nurseries, and you get species from all over the world. New Zealand is the most common, appear in Britain. And I found an article online that made reference to this species that had been found in Bedfordshire by someone who works for the Wildlife Trust there. And it turned out to be the first of its kind ever to be found in Britain. So I sent this record off to an expert from the Natural History Museum, a guy called Dr. Hugh Jones, who's like the leading expert in flatworms in Britain. And he confirmed that it was this same species he'd been sent as the first for Britain. So it was only the second ever of its kind to be found anywhere in the world. But it was a species that originated from New Zealand, hadn't been named at that stage because he only had the one specimen to work from, but then he had a handful from Attenborough Nature Reserve that he was able then to say, this is the species. We called it, I think it was Marion Fyfia adventor. So the first part of the Latin name, there was a lady called Marion Fyfe from New Zealand who was an expert in flatworms. So he named the first bit after her. And adventor means the traveller. So it was quite nice because it had obviously appeared in Britain.
Wow.
But yeah, so I've come close. I've never found a new for science.
I mean, and to kind of be credited with finding a previously unknown species of anything, I guess it's like you must have to go through a lot of hoops before somebody finally says, no, you're right, this is brand new, nobody's ever found this before. You can't just say, hey, I've got this. And
it's a lengthy process. Obviously, you've got to prove that it's never been found before in the world. Then you've got to identify it, and you're referring to material from all over the world. It can be quite a lengthy process just identifying that it's never been recorded.
When there's 400,000 known species, to prove that the thing you've got on your microscope slide or whatever is not one of those 400,000, that's a huge task.
It's a huge undertaking. Go to the tropics is probably the best place, because obviously only about 1% of stuff has been identified from the tropics and catalogued and named. Whereas I think we've got quite a long history of natural history and studying natural history in the UK. I'd like to say we probably know as much as we're going to know about a lot of the macro species, the larger species. But I suppose when you go down to soil invertebrates and things like that, it might be a bit different. But it's harder and harder to find new species for Britain. Although again, with climate change, we're seeing novel species appear from southern climes as we get milder and warmer winters and summers.
Sure. So the answer to my question about your life outside of this ended up talking about beetles.
My life outside of this is this. I think it becomes all absorbing. Unfortunately, I've got a very forgiving family that also like going outdoors and spending time in nature. So probably not as obsessed as I am, but it helps.
Yeah. I mean, if you've got kids and they love that sort of stuff, that's brilliant. Yeah,
there's a massive disconnect at the moment, with kids and nature and getting people out, getting families outdoors. Very fortunate that I can pass on some of my knowledge and interest in conservation to them. So
this might be a good time to promote the Rutland Beer Festival, which is happening in the last weekend of June. So 27th, 28th, 29th of June, it's going to be at the Rutland Museum in Oakham. And there's going to be stacks of different types of beers and ciders to try. I'm a real ale man. And when last year I got sidetracked into the cider, somebody said, you have to taste this cider. And it was like your typical scrumpy, where you can't see through it. And there's things like living inside it.
Nice.
And apparently it's from this guy in Somerset who's the typical cider person.
You should get Tim to get under his microscope. It'd be terrifying.
Brilliant.
So about 4 or 5 ciders later, I tried to stand up and my legs went like jelly. But I tell you what, that is definitely worth trying. Some seriously good stuff. Yeah.
Bad experiences with Scrumpy as a kid, and I've not been able to drink it since. So it's just the bits of apple when you get to the bottom of the barrel that, it disagreed with my stomach.
Yeah. Well, I think the winner for that was Manton cider, just on the doorstep
really?
of Rutland Water. Yes, I think.
Yeah.
Charlie, who's a nice guy, used to come in the vaults sort of quite a bit, and he used to use the brew house, because before COVID, the company, the Wills group, they did their own brewing. Just for, I think it was only from March 2019 to 2020, made some batches, and then COVID hit. But I know Charlie, who now does it up because he lives in Manton, had that sort of started out there with his brother and did a nice, interesting West Coast IPA. He never made a cider, but obviously I hear that's really good.
Have you ever tried making your own?
I've never tried making my own. I'm quite happy trying to keep it and condition the beer, but never making it. I mean, that's a bit.
Have you?
Yeah, we had an apple tree in the garden, and we thought, well, what are we going to do with this glut of apples we had one year? It was like one of these mast years, where it's just absolutely full.
Did you know
normally
what
we'd
type
make
of
apple pies? It was Bramley apples,
but
we thought, well, let's try and make some cider from it. And so we got a proper apple press from a friend, squashed a load of apples down and made it into this cider, and we opened it up at the Christmas. So this was sort of in September time. Opened it up at Christmas, and crikey, it was lively. You literally pop the caps and poof, go off. But it was amazing stuff. But I probably wouldn't do it again. It's the space you need in the kitchen, the mess you make and stuff.
And the after
stick
effects.
to the pies.
You might be able to actually shed some light on this. My wife claims that wasps get angry later in the year because they get drunk on fallen apples that ferment.
Okay, so this is a life cycle thing with wasps. So
Is it a myth or is it
it
fact?
is a myth. Yeah, it's a myth. So the reason for them getting angry later in the year is because they're hungry. So obviously they've got those really what they call the gaster. They've got those really thin bit between the abdomen and the main part of its body, the thorax, and they can't eat solid food, so they have to eat liquid food, which is normally given to them by the larvae. So the adults go off, they find things like early on in the season it will be aphids and other small invertebrates and insects, bring them back to the larvae eat those, which gives them the protein boost and enables them to grow, and then they secrete a very sugary liquid which rewards the adults, which then feeds them. Later on in the season, the larvae stop getting produced by the queen, and therefore there's nothing left for the adults to be fed. So that's why they go out in search of sugary liquids, ciders, beer, McDonald's milkshakes, whatever it is, because they're basically starving hungry. Yeah. So, yeah.
Do you know?
So when you find them inside an apple, absolutely staggering, because the apple's fallen from the tree and started to ferment.
They're probably just on their way out, later in the year, Although I actually had a wasp nest in my kitchen roof space that was still active on Christmas Day last year. So
How did you find that out? That was
well, we gave it a little miniature Christmas tree. We put it under the roof tile so that the wasps could celebrate Christmas. I've never known a wasp nest to still be active in late December. It
Would have to be
incredible.
you, wouldn't it?
Well, it was brilliant. Yeah, I put it on the UK Bees, Ants and Wasps Facebook groups. I thought this is great, and it turns out that year there was a number of wasp nests still active that late in the year, but most of them down in sort of Sussex and the south coast. So yeah.
Wow. Do you know? I reckon we should ask one of our 2 listeners if they've got any.
If they've got an interesting story about wasps.
No, if they've got any entomology questions, to send them in, and we will send them to Tim and see if he can endeavour to answer them for you.
Sounds
Before
great.
we wrap up, I have to give you my little factoid.
Okay.
Because when I decided to fact check your 600 species of beetle in the space of a Rutland water,
Was it 599?
yeah, and then found that there are 400,000 species of beetle that people have actually taken the trouble to document, which is extraordinary in itself. I went down a bit of a rabbit hole, and I was curious as to what the total weight or the total amount of insect material on the planet is.
Tonnage.
Yeah. And apparently it's estimated as 1 billion metric tons of insects on the planet. And I couldn't really visualise 1 billion metric tons.
Something like the moon.
I've no idea, but the way I managed to get it into a context that I could understand, if you got Wembley Stadium and you built 72 of them side by side and you filled each one with lead, then you'd have the same weight, the same mass, not the volume, because the insects are a lot lighter than lead, so there'd be a lot more volume, but because I couldn't find the average weight of an insect, I had to
This
go...
is some rabbit hole.
Yeah.
now that's a pub quiz question. That is, yeah.
So to represent all of the insect mass on the planet, you would have to have 72 Wembley stadiums filled with lead. It's
a lot of insects.
That's a lot of insects.
It is, yeah.
What proportion of those can hurt you? Quite a lot, I reckon.
Probably about 1 or 2. Yeah. I think people that think that insects are out to get them all the time. I mean, yeah, they'll hurt you, but the percentage that can kill you, I think, is very minimal.
Yeah, but don't
On the
forget, in
grand
relative
scheme of
terms,
things,
they're a lot bigger to
probably
me than they are to you.
0.01%, I would imagine. So like your wife who's scared of spiders, I would sort of argue with her that the spider's, a fraction of her size, and the spider's probably more scared of her than she is of them, really, to be honest.
Apparently the most poisonous one in UK is that one really spindly one. But not to humans, but to other spiders.
Yeah. Fulcus phalangioides is that one, so that the cellar spider, as they commonly call it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you should leave those in your house.
We've got false widows living in our lean-to at home. So this is
We've had one in our garage. Yeah.
But again, they say that they're deadly. We call it the Daily Mail spider in the sort of entomological world, because it's the one that you guarantee around September time every year there'll be some horror story about some guy from Bradford that got bit by one and his arm dropped off or something. But basically, I mean, they've got the venom is a neurotoxin, so basically it paralyzes the prey. It's not necrotic, which would cause your arm to drop off. But what the problem is they've got bitten by a spider. They've gone out, grubbed around in the garden or done whatever and not bathed for a couple of days, and it's got infected, and then that's caused the necrosis.
Okay.
But, you know, if you think this spider came from Tenerife and the Canary Islands into the UK with bananas probably about 150 years ago, there's no reported cases of deaths or any massive injury from the Canary Islands in history. So it's unlikely that since they came to the UK, they've suddenly become this man-killing Daily Mail headline.
We're not as tough as those
writing.
Mediterraneans.
Well, it's questionable, isn't it? But I've tried to photograph this one that I've got in my lean-to, this big female that's sat in the corner of the lean-to for about the last 3 or 4 months. And every time I go anywhere near it and accidentally trigger one of the lines of silk from the web, she just dashes away and will hide for about 2 or 3 weeks before coming out again. So, yeah, I'm sure any bites are just, you know, accidental rather than it's gone out purposefully looking to cause harm.
Well,
I'm with Sue. I'm terrified of spiders. as
yeah,
well.
I know you are.
Unfortunately, our eldest son is the only one in the family that was brave enough to just pick spiders up. So when the boys left home, me and my wife had to kind of have this standoff. And we've got this arrangement now where she will get a glass and a piece of paper and remove it, and I bravely hold the door open.
Well done.
There's still honour.
Oh dear.
And on that bombshell.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you very much, Lammie and Tim.
Pleasure.
For your time. That was brilliant. And I really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thank you. It was good fun.
Thank you for listening to part 2 of The Vaults, and we hope you enjoyed it. Our next pub natter comes from Empingham Cricket and Social Club in Rutland. We are hosted by Russ Hibbett, and our guest is Paul Dadford, the Chair of Trustees of the Oakham Canal Green Corridor Project. We do not make any money from these podcasts and present them purely to promote Rutland's watering holes and give a voice to local folk. You, yes, that's you, can help us by leaving a review on your preferred podcast platform. We prefer Apple, as that is where we have most listeners, but are happy to receive any reviews on any podcast platform. Reviews help us to increase our audience, which helps to promote Rutland. The theme music is by Tom Arnold. That was a Pub Natter broadcast.